Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. You know, usually when we talk about the survival of an institution, there's this expectation of a straight, unbroken line, like a steel beam.
Right.
You look at a massive corporation or a government agency, and you just assume it was engineered to last forever, built on a rock, totally impervious to the elements.
Yeah, it feels permanent, like it's binary. It exists, therefore it was always going to exist. We really like our history clean and inevitable.
We do.
Yeah.
But then you step into the world of historical nonprofits, specifically urban rescue missions, and suddenly that steel beam looks a lot more like a really fragile threat.
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at an organizational landscape that is honestly incredibly vulnerable. I mean, how does a grassroots charity survive for 125 years?
It's a great question.
Through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, massive shifts in demographics, and, complete overhauls of the American social contract.
Right. It's the absolute definition of institutional survival against the odds. It requires a level of adaptability that, frankly, most Fortune 500 companies never manage to achieve.
Yeah.
Because you aren't just selling a product, right? You're trying to solve the most intractable human problems. Poverty, addiction, isolation in environments that are just constantly shifting underneath your feet.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive into our source material for today, which are excerpts from the book The Story of Wheeler Mission by Rob Wingerter and Julie Alvis.
It's going to be a really interesting one.
It is. We're going to trace the history of Indianapolis's Wheeler Mission from its founding in 1893 all the way up to 2018. We're going to look at how they changed their buildings, their programs, their marketing, and their leadership, all while trying to hold on to a core DNA of help, hope, and healing.
And, it is crucial to establish right up front for you listening that this isn't just local Indianapolis history.
Right. It's bigger than that.
Way bigger. Yes, the geography is specific, but the themes are universal. The history of Wheeler Mission is truly a microcosm of the American religious experience. What we are really tracing here is the deep underlying tension between spiritual evangelism and physical social work in America.
Oh, well, yeah.
It's a push and pull that defines almost every major social movement of the last century and a half.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before we could even meet the founders of Wheeler Mission, we really need to understand the world they were living in. We have to set the stage.
Absolutely.
The sources take us back to the volatile post-Civil War American landscape. This era, basically from 1865 to 1918, is what historian Mark Knoll called the high watermark of Protestant America.
And that is a critical starting point for you as the listener to grasp. The end of the Civil War left a staggering human cost in its wake.
Just massive trauma.
Exactly. Hundreds of thousands dead, communities shattered, and an entire nation collectively traumatized and really questioning their worldviews.
Yeah.
And right before that, you had the financial panic of 1857. So you have people looking for answers, looking for stability. And historically, times of deep societal trauma often trigger massive religious responses.
Which brings us to the Third Great Awakening, right?
Yes, exactly. This period birthed what is known as the Third Great Awakening.
And it wasn't just a quiet contemplative awakening. It was loud, it was public, and it was deeply practical.
Very much so.
You had figures like Phoebe Palmer, a Methodist lay leader who was touring the country, pushing for earnest prayer and revival. But the name that really jumps out from the sources, the guy who sort of defined the era's pragmatic approach, is D.L. Moody.
Dwight L. Moody is fascinating. He fundamentally changed the aesthetic and the mechanics of American evangelism.
How so?
Well, prior to Moody, you had figures who were incredibly intense, highly theological, sometimes very theatrical. Moody comes along and he essentially looks and acts like a businessman.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he was highly practical. He focused on common sense themes of Christian sentiment rather than, dense theological debates. He stripped away a lot of the high church formality.
He practically invented the modern megachurch campaign model from what I'm reading.
He really did.
During the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, he held a 6-week campaign that drew an average of 150,000 people a week.
Which is just a mind-boggling number for that time.
That's stadium-level attendance. But what I love about this is that we aren't just talking about a guy shouting from a stage. When the Great Chicago Fire happened, he lost his church, he lost his home, but he immediately organized broad-based relief efforts.
Right, that's a practical side.
Yeah. He founded classes for women to learn life skills. It was this dual mandate: save the soul, but also feed the body and rebuild the city.
if we connect this to the bigger picture, Moody wasn't operating in a vacuum. This dual mandate was catching fire globally.
Like in London, right?
Exactly. In 1865, the exact same year the Civil War ended here, William and Catherine Booth were walking the slums of Whitechapel in London.
Wow, the timing.
Yeah, and they were seeing neglected children, widespread alcoholism, desperate poverty, the people William Booth called the waifs and strays.
Right.
And they founded the Christian Mission, which soon became the Salvation Army. They applied a strict military organizational structure to social work and evangelism.
Which was revolutionary.
It was. You also had massive student and missionary movements launching, like the student volunteer movement in 1876 and the African Inland Mission in 1895. There was this incredible muscular optimism that the world could be reached and reformed.
And this is a massive, but for our deep dive, while all of this religious fervor is happening on the streets, there's a total intellectual earthquake happening in the universities and the culture at large.
Oh, a massive shift.
It's like an existential identity crisis for American Protestantism.
Exactly. The intellectual and philosophical challenges of the era were profound. You have the long-term effects of philosophers like René Descartes, who argued that human reason, not divine revelation, was the ultimate source of truth.
His famous, I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. And then, of course, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species is published, fundamentally challenging the traditional Judeo-Christian view of human origins and the universe.
And it wasn't just theoretical debates in dusty libraries, right? It hit the funding.
The money always dictates the direction.
Yeah, for centuries, universities were largely founded and funded by religious denominations to train clergy and educated lay people. But suddenly you have this new class of mega-wealthy entrepreneurs.
The titans of industry.
Right, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, Ezra Cornell. They start pouring vast, unprecedented sums of money into creating the modern university system.
And with that shift in funding came a massive shift in focus. The emphasis moved away from understanding the divine toward scientific inquiry, free choice, personal consumption, and self-sufficiency.
So secularizing the institutions.
Yes. Unbelief, or at least a highly secularized worldview, became just as respectable as belief among the intellectual elite. This birthed the great clash between modernism and fundamentalism.
I want to make sure I'm understanding the stakes of that clash correctly. And just to be clear for you listening, our goal here isn't to take a theological side in that debate. We are just impartially exploring the historical landscape presented in the sources.
Right, we're just looking at what happened.
Exactly. But as an analogy, it seems like these two factions were looking at the exact same building and disagreeing on how to keep it standing.
That's a good way to put it.
The fundamentalists looked at the core tenets of front as load-bearing walls remove one, and the entire house collapses. But the modernists saw those same tenets as cosmetic interior walls that needed to be knocked down to make the house livable for the modern, scientifically minded person.
That is a perfect analogy. The modernists believed that the Christian faith had to adapt to modern scientific and cultural norms to stay relevant. The fundamentalists believed there were strict, uncompromisable tenets of the faith that couldn't be altered without destroying the religion itself. It was two halves of a massive institution trying to steer the ship in opposite directions.
And this philosophical tension physically collides in the rapidly industrializing American city.
It all comes to a head there.
So you have an aging agrarian society, an intellectual civil war, and an exploding industrial economy. And the pressure cooker where all those things meet is the urban center. Which brings us to the very real streets of Indianapolis in the late 1800s.
The growth was unreal.
The numbers here are just staggering. In 1850, Indianapolis was basically a large town, an agricultural hub with about 8,000 people.
Tiny.
Yeah, but by 1900, it had exploded to over 160,000 people.
It is the classic story of the American Industrial Revolution. Railroads are being built, converging on the city, massive stockyards are constructed.
Right, the infrastructure boom.
Yeah, you have food processing like the Van Camp canning operations and heady manufacturing. This draws thousands of people, immigrants from overseas, workers from the post-war South, people leaving rural Indiana farms. They're all flooding into the city looking for wages.
But rapid growth always has a dark side. The infrastructure couldn't keep up. You have poor working conditions, impossibly long hours, zero labor protections, and suddenly a highly visible, desperate underclass living on the streets of a city that just 50 years prior was mostly farmland.
It was a recipe for disaster.
And into this chaos steps William Vincent Wheeler.
William Wheeler is a fascinating historical archetype. He wasn't a trained theologian. He wasn't a wealthy philanthropist. No. He was a hardware salesman who moved to Indy from Ohio.
Just a regular guy.
Exactly. He married a woman named Mary Node, and he became incredibly active as a Sunday school superintendent at the Central Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a respected middle-class guy serving on building committees.
But he couldn't ignore what was happening outside his church doors. The exact origin spark happened in 1893. Wheeler, his wife Mary, and a woman named Celia Smock, who was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, are walking downtown.
Right.
And they see what the historical record refers to as friendless women roaming the streets. Often, these were young women who were pregnant, abandoned, or totally destitute, completely left behind by the industrial boom.
And we really need to pause on that detail.
Why is that?
Because when most people picture a 19th century rescue mission, they picture soup kitchens and rows of cots for transient men, the stereotypical hobo of the industrial age riding the rails.
Right, that's definitely the cliche.
But Wheeler Mission didn't start that way. It started specifically as an outreach to vulnerable women.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't just form a committee to talk about it. They took immediate physical action. They rented an upstairs room on South Delaware Street. They offered safe housing and warm meals. They called it the Door of Hope.
A great name.
Yeah. And it grew so fast that by 1895, just 2 years later, Wheeler reaches a breaking point. He realizes he can't run a rapidly growing social service agency and keep his day job at Lehman Carey Hardware.
That is the ultimate moment of vocational crisis. He resigns from his stable, prominent sales position to become the full-time superintendent of the mission, relying entirely on donor support.
Picture this. It's the 1890s. There's no FDIC insurance. There's no modern social safety net or unemployment checks.
Nothing to fall back on.
The country has just weathered severe financial panics, and Wheeler goes to his wife and says, "I'm quitting my stable corporate job to rely entirely on the spare change of strangers to run a homeless shelter."
It's wild.
The psychological toll of that risk must have been immense.
It really speaks to Wheeler's holistic philosophy, which he likely absorbed from the broader movements of his day, like Moody and the Salvation Army. He fundamentally believed that you cannot minister to a person's soul if their body is freezing and starving. In his view, providing a meal and a bed wasn't just a precursor to preaching, it was the gospel in action. And he was incredibly effective at mobilizing the city to help.
He really was. He used his connections, his church, his Masonic lodge, the local business community to build a massive coalition of support. By 1906, they had raised enough money to build a custom state-of-the-art facility at 443 Southeast Street.
Not just an upstairs room anymore?
No, this wasn't a storefront. They built a comprehensive social service engine, a chapel, a mother's meeting room, rooms for Sunday school, and in the basement, lodging and showers for men, plus a woodyard where men could work for their keep.
And he gained the trust of the civic establishment. Judges would routinely refer men and women from the courts to Wheeler's programs instead of throwing them in jail. He had successfully institutionalized his vision.
That's huge.
It is, but as history constantly shows us, organizations built entirely around the charisma and vision of a single founder are incredibly fragile.
Which sets the stage for a massive organizational crisis. In 1908, William Wheeler dies.
Yeah.
It's a sudden, tragic loss. And it instantly proves your point. When the visionary is gone, who decides the vision?
The statistics from this era say it all. In the 15 years following Wheeler's death, the mission goes through 8 different superintendents.
8. Wow.
8. That is catastrophic turnover for any organization, let alone a charity that relies on public trust and consistent donor relations.
It's pure operational chaos. You have an elderly board member, William H. Roll, stepping in to serve as an interim leader in his 70s just to keep the lights on.
Just trying to hold it together.
Right. But the real operational glue during this era, the person keeping the actual mission alive on the ground, was William's widow, Mary Node.
She's the unsung hero here.
She really is. She maintained the sewing schools for neighborhood children, and she spent immense amounts of time visiting inmates in the local jails and prisons.
And we have this incredible, poignant artifact of her work, a letter written in 1925 by an inmate named Leslie Sanders from the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth.
Oh, what did he say?
It's a deeply moving letter where he essentially says that her prayers and her visits were the only things tethering him to humanity when everyone else had given up on him.
Wow. That's powerful.
It highlights that while the boardroom was in chaos, The ground level, one-on-one work of the mission was still changing lives because of people like Mary.
But back in that boardroom, a civil war of ideas is brewing. The board brings in new leadership, and with them comes a fundamentally different philosophy of what a rescue mission should be.
And this is where it gets contentious.
Yeah, a guy named Mill Trotter starts to heavily influence the national rescue mission scene. Trotter was a converted alcoholic from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he was highly charismatic. He became the face of a new wave of mission work that focused heavily, almost exclusively, on mass evangelism for down-and-out men.
This raises an important question, one that almost destroyed the organization: mission drift. How do you decide your core identity when your stakeholders have fundamentally competing visions?
They can't.
Right. You have Wheeler's original vision, which was holistic caring for women, families, providing physical relief alongside spiritual guidance. And then you have this new faction, influenced by Trotter, arguing that the mission should pivot to focus on mass evangelistic rallies for transient men. The internal tension became unbearable.
It's exactly like a corporate merger, where two companies with completely incompatible cultures are forced to share an office. The donors and board members were fundamentally split. And the result, a literal schism.
A split right down the middle.
In 1917, a guy named John Hewson, who favored the Trotter approach, actually leaves and opens a rival organization right down the street called the City Mission.
It is the ultimate manifestation of organizational failure. You literally spawn your own direct competitor in the same neighborhood. And Houston's City Mission was highly successful. It siphoned off support, leaving Wheeler Rescue Mission struggling to survive.
But the reality of running two competing charities in the same city during World War I eventually forced their hands. The economics just didn't work.
It wasn't sustainable.
No. So in 1918, the two rival missions realized they can't survive divided, so they merge. They become the Wheeler City Rescue Mission. And they bring in a dynamic new superintendent named James Nipper to lead the combined entity.
Nipper seemed to be exactly what they needed to bridge the divide. He was energetic, he galvanized the board, he brought in new donors, and he started holding massive, culturally relevant services at the Empire Theater.
Things were looking up.
Yeah, it looked like the 15 years of chaos were finally over.
And then pure, unmitigated tragedy strikes again. In September 1920, James Nipper and his wife were returning to Indianapolis in an automobile. They are crossing the tracks near Arlington and 21st Streets, and their car is struck by an interurban rail car.
Oh, terrible.
They are killed instantly. 2,500 people attended their memorial. It's a devastating blow to an organization that had just barely found its footing.
It forces the board of directors to do some profound soul-searching. In 1921, they held a critical meeting. They had a general discussion on the overarching plans and purposes of the mission. They had to decide, once and for all, who they were.
What did they decide?
Well, they made a definitive choice. They decided to return to William Wheeler's original roots as a social services provider with a balanced approach, stepping back from the purely mass evangelism model that had caused so much friction.
And to lead this return to their roots, they hire a man who would define the next 2 decades. In 1923, Herbert E. Eberhart takes over. If Wheeler was the visionary founder, Eberhart was the master builder who anchored the mission into the modern era.
His timing was impeccable.
It really was, because his timing couldn't have been more critical, with the Great Depression looming just around the corner.
Eberhart's era is marked by incredible expansion and modernization. In 1929, they dedicate a massive new facility at 245 North Delaware Street.
Oh, the Delaware building.
Yes. And the irony of this location is profound. It was built on the exact site of the former Old Elm Saloon. They literally replaced a place of despair with a place of hope. And they crowned the building with this massive copyrighted revolving cross that became an iconic symbol in the Indianapolis skyline.
But the building wasn't even his most innovative move. Let's talk about the radio.
Oh, this is brilliant.
In 1927, Eberhart approaches WFBM, one of the first radio stations in Indianapolis. He gets them to broadcast a rescue mission conference. The station manager loves it so much, he offers Eberhart a weekly hour-long slot. Every Wednesday night, Eberhart broadcasts live. He becomes known as the radio pastor.
We have to pause and consider how radical this was for a nonprofit in 1927.
I mean, it was brand new tech.
Radio was the cutting-edge technology of the era. It was the social media, the internet, and the television of its day all rolled into one. Eberhard recognized that the airwaves could bypass the physical limitations of his building and take the mission's message and its need for funding directly into the living rooms of thousands of families across central Indiana.
He was a pioneer.
Wheeler became the very first rescue mission in America with a radio program.
It completely transformed their visibility.
Yeah.
And thank God they had that visibility, because in 1929, the stock market crashes and the Great Depression hits.
Everything changes overnight.
The demographics of the people coming to the mission changed completely. It wasn't just the chronically transient men anymore. Suddenly, the lobby is filled with self-respecting men, former bankers, tradesmen, fathers who have lost absolutely everything and are lining up for a bed and a meal. The mission is pushed to its absolute limits.
And this brings up one of Eberhard's most controversial and defining leadership decisions.
Okay, let's hear it.
As the Depression deepened, the federal government under FDR rolled out massive relief funds through the New Deal. The mission's board pressed Eberhard to apply for this federal aid to help carry the crushing financial burden. But Eberhard firmly refused.
Wait, I have to push back on that. You're in the middle of the Great Depression, you have starving families in your lobby, you're overwhelmed with need, and FDR is handing out federal relief money, and Eberhard says no.
That's right.
That sounds borderline irresponsible. Again, impartially speaking, how did he justify turning away money that could have bought food for freezing people?
It comes down to a deep conviction regarding institutional autonomy. Eberhard fundamentally believed that taking government money meant accepting government oversight.
Strings attached.
Exactly. He was convinced that federal regulations, however well-intentioned, would eventually force the mission to strip away its primary religious purpose and message. He viewed the spiritual and the physical as inseparable.
If he couldn't offer both, he wasn't fulfilling the mission.
Right. So he chose financial hardship and reliance on private donors over compromising the mission's core identity. To this day, it remains the policy of Wheeler Mission not to accept federal aid for operations.
It's a massive, definitive line drawn in the sand. And it ties into his broader ecclesiology, his view of the church. Eberhard didn't want the mission to become a substitute for a local congregation.
No, he saw them as very distinct.
He believed the mission's job was triage. Stabilize the person, get them fed, get them sober, address their immediate spiritual and physical crises. But once they were stable, the mission actively pushed them to integrate into local neighborhood churches.
The mission was the emergency room.
Exactly. And the local church was the long-term physical therapy.
It was an incredibly disciplined approach to ministry. By the time Eberhard prepared to step down in 1943, after 20 years at the helm, the mission was stable, respected, and clear on its identity. He even handpicked his successor, a man he met through the National Rescue Mission Network, a man named Leonard Hunt.
So what does this all mean? We transitioned from the Depression and World War II into the mid-century era, and we meet Leonard and Francis Hunt. If Eberhard was the modernizer, the Hunts were the ultimate embodiment of servant leadership.
Their dedication was just unmatched.
There is a 1973 newspaper article by an Indianapolis Star columnist that just highlights the sheer physical toll of their work. The journalist notes that the Hunts had been leading the mission for 30 years, and they were working 15 to 16-hour days.
15 hours.
7 days a week. And for all of that, their combined salary was barely $10,000 a year.
It is an almost incomprehensible level of vocational calling. To sustain that level of output for 3 decades without burning out requires a deeply internalized conviction that the work is a divine mandate, not just a career.
Yeah.
Leonard Hunt famously told the reporter that he always prayed God would make him a great preacher, but instead God just made him happy doing the work.
But the Hunts era wasn't just about long hours. It was about navigating incredibly complex societal shifts. Indianapolis was changing, the post-war boom was happening, the interstate highway system was being built, and suburbs were expanding.
The whole map was shifting.
But the most pressing issue they had to face was systemic racism and segregation. In 1945, the Church Federation of Indianapolis formally challenged Wheeler Mission regarding its policies on accommodating transient black men.
This is a vital piece of the historical record. To understand this 1945 challenge, we have to look neutrally at the mechanics of transient housing and the sociology of the era.
Right. Just the facts of how it operated.
The Church Federation wrote to Hunt questioning their policies. Hunt wrote a detailed response explaining the logistical reality as he saw it. He stated that the mission never refused immediate help, food, clothing, intake counseling to anyone, regardless of race.
But the overnight accommodations were a different story.
Yes. Hunt explained that because the mission operated with confined sleeping quarters, essentially massive open-air dormitories, the deep-seated racial prejudices of the transient white guests created an explosive and dangerous environment if the dorms were integrated.
Oh, I see.
The Hunt administration felt trapped between their mandate to provide shelter and the volatile reality of their demographic. Their stopgap solution, referring black men to the colored YMCA or the Good Samaritan Rescue Mission for overnight lodging, was a direct reflection of the systemic bottlenecks created by a segregated society.
It highlights how the societal norms of the 1940s created severe moral compromises even in charity work. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was a reflection of a deeply flawed era.
Absolutely.
However, as society began to shift, Wheeler Mission did evolve. It wasn't until the civil rights shifts of the 1960s that they fully dismantled this system and fully integrated all of their overnight accommodations.
It shows an organization wrestling with the practical realities of their environment and eventually aligning its practices with its deeper theological convictions regarding equality. During this same period, the Hunts were also expanding the mission's footprint in other ways. In 1950, Frances Hunt established the Women's Auxiliary. She gathered women from across the city to support the mission, which eventually led to the purchase of a dedicated women's home on North New Jersey Street. They were returning to William Wheeler's original focus on women.
And they didn't stop at the city limits. In 1959, Leonard Hunt realizes a long-held dream. He buys 165 acres of land down in rural Monroe County to establish a youth camp, Camp Hunt.
Oh, I love the detail about the bell.
Yeah. The New York Central Railroad actually donated an old locomotive bell. They mounted it at the camp and used it to call the inner-city kids to meals. It was a place for these kids to get out of the industrial smog and experience nature, social development, and spiritual guidance.
But despite these incredible programs, by the late 1970s and 1980s, the mission was struggling. Leonard Hunt retired. His successor, a man named Brown, struggled to gain traction. The board of directors had aged. Many had been serving since the Eberhard days.
The momentum was gone.
Yeah, the downtown facilities were decaying. The city was modernizing, and the mission was stagnating. They were losing guests to newer, more modern shelters. By 1990, the organization was at a critical inflection point.
So you have an aging board, decaying buildings, and an exploding homeless population. The mom-and-pop model has officially hit its mathematical limit. How do you corporatize a charity without losing its soul?
It's the million-dollar question.
That is the question they had to answer, and the answer arrived in 1990 with a man named Rick Alvis.
The transformation under Alvis is, frankly, staggering. Let's look at the operational growth. When Rick arrived, the mission had an annual budget of about $300,000, 17 staff members, and a bed capacity of around 70.
Okay, so pretty small.
By 2018, the budget was over $11 million. They had over 200 staff members. And on a single winter night, they were sheltering over 900 individuals.
That's explosive scaling of operations. Alvis realized that to meet the modern scale of homelessness, the organization needed corporate-level strategy. He rebranded the organization from Wheeler City Rescue Mission to Wheeler Mission Ministries, complete with a new logo signaling a broader regional scope.
He also understood that you don't always have to build from scratch to expand your reach. You can grow through strategic alliances.
Right, mergers.
To survive and scale, Wheeler started absorbing other struggling ministries to create a comprehensive safety net. They took over the Care Center, which was a facility for women and children started by businessmen from Englewood Christian Church. They merged with Lighthouse Mission. They even expanded geographically down to Bloomington by taking over the Backstreet Mission.
What's fascinating here is the financial philosophy behind this massive growth. We often assume that an $11 million nonprofit is just coasting on massive, multi-million-dollar corporate grants.
Oh, sure.
But that wasn't the case. Yes, they had major capital campaigns like the 2000 and Beyond campaign, which was anchored by a surprise $1 million bequest from a late board member, John D. Hughes. But the day-to-day operating budget, in 2017, the average individual donation was only $90.
That is the genius of their psychological approach to fundraising. That budget is built on tens of thousands of individual middle-class donors who faithfully write small checks every month.
It's so resilient.
It's a deeply diversified grassroots funding model. It protects them from the volatility of losing a single massive corporate sponsor, and they paired that with a strict, unbending financial policy. They never incurred debt for operational expenses.
Zero debt.
If they don't have the money to run a program, they don't run it. They maintain strict certification with the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, the ECFA.
And to handle all of this, Alex brings in the Chief Operating Officer, Steve Meyer. It shows the evolution. You can't run human resources, payroll, compliance, and facility management for 200 employees out of a shoebox.
Right. You need a pro.
He professionalized the back office so the frontline workers could focus entirely on the mission.
And that mission evolved significantly under Alvis. He realized that 3 hots and a cot, just giving someone a meal and a bed, wasn't enough to solve modern homelessness.
Such as the Band-Aid.
Right. The issues driving people to the streets, severe trauma, generational poverty, complex chemical dependencies, were too complex for just overnight lodging, so they moved to a model of comprehensive care.
They launched the Hebron Addiction Recovery Program out of the old Camp Hunt property. They added mental health care partnerships. They built transitional services to help guys get jobs, learn financial literacy, and move back into society. They attacked the root causes, not just the symptoms.
And that brings us full circle. The 125-year history of Wheeler Mission is a masterclass in adaptation. They survived because they were willing to tear down old buildings and build new ones. They survived because they were willing to change their name, upgrade their technology from radio to the internet, professionalize their staff, and integrate their facilities. But they never altered the foundational premise that William Wheeler established in that upstairs room in 1893, that every human being, no matter how broken, deserves help, hope, and healing.
It is an incredible legacy. You, as the listener, have just traveled through 125 years of history. You've seen the fragility of the thread, but also the resilience of the people who refuse to let it snap.
I think the most fitting way to close this analysis is to consider a provocative hypothetical.
Okay, what is it?
If William Wheeler were to magically appear on the streets of downtown Indianapolis today, what would he see? On one hand, he would undoubtedly be astounded by the multi-million-dollar facilities, the advanced addiction science, and the sheer scale of the organization bearing his name. He would be amazed by the logistics of feeding and housing 900 people a night. But wouldn't he also be deeply heartbroken? Heartbroken to look out the window of those modern facilities and realize that 125 years later, despite all the technological progress, the corporate expansion, and the immense economic wealth of the 21st century, the root causes of human suffering, isolation, and desperate poverty that he first saw from his hardware store in 1893 are still exactly the same.
Wow.
The tools have changed, the buildings are bigger, but the human condition remains stubbornly, tragically intact.
That is a heavy but vital thought to leave on. The work, it seems, is never truly finished. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new perspective on history, institutional survival, and the ongoing work of rescue missions. Until next time.